As the golden light of early morning filtered through the canopy of olive trees, a soft breeze stirred the dust of a well-trodden path, leading to a modest Roman villa nestled in the peaceful countryside. The villa, with its terracotta roof and weathered stone walls, stood as a quiet testament to a life built not of grandeur, but of steady hands, patient labor, and a rhythm governed by the turning of the seasons rather than the ticking of clocks. Birds chirped lazily in the branches, and the scent of dewy grass mixed with the faint aroma of baking bread. This was not the Rome of emperors and senate halls, but the Rome of farmers, of men and women whose lives moved with the sun, whose worries rarely extended beyond their land, their harvest, and the well-being of their families. Within the villa, Lucius, a humble farmer in his 4th decade of life, rose quietly from his straw-stuffed mattress. The room around him was simple: plastered walls, a shelf with a few clay lamps, and a low table where his wife, Marcia, had placed a folded tunic the night before. Lucius moved carefully so as not to wake her, though she stirred gently, opening her eyes just enough to offer him a sleepy smile. Their shared life was one of tranquil routine, built on mutual care and an understanding that came not from words, but from countless days spent in each other's quiet presence. He dressed, splashed his face with water from the ceramic basin, and stepped into the small courtyard, where the first rays of sunlight kissed the stone floor. A chicken clucked from a nearby coop, and the low bleating of a goat reminded him that morning chores awaited. But before he bent to work, Lucius paused, as he did every day, to take in the calm beauty around him. The cypress trees standing tall against the lightening sky, the sound of a stream trickling just beyond the vineyard, the smell of earth rich with life. Soon his son Tiberius, a boy of 12 summers with wide eyes and a curious mind, joined him. Together they moved through their morning tasks, feeding the animals, checking the irrigation channels, and inspecting the grapevines that would later yield wine for local trade. Tiberius asked questions about the soil, the weather, the stars, and Lucius answered them with a patience cultivated through years of tilling the land and nurturing both crops and children. By mid-morning, Marcia had prepared a modest meal of olives, bread, and goat cheese, which they ate beneath the pergola shaded by creeping vines. Conversation flowed gently, touching on plans for the day, small village gossip, and Tiberius's hopes of one day visiting Rome itself. Though the capital lay many days' journey away, its presence was a distant hum in their lives, a source of stories and wonder, but rarely disruption. After breakfast, Lucius worked in the fields, his hands moving with practiced ease through rows of wheat. Each movement, each step, each breath seemed to harmonize with the land itself. The sun rose higher, but the pace of life never felt hurried. Nearby, Marcia tended to the herb garden, her fingers lightly brushing the leaves of lavender and thyme. The scents rose around her like incense, calming and familiar. In the early afternoon, as the heat reached its peak, the family rested. This was the sacred hour of repose, where even the dogs lay motionless in the shade. Inside the villa, the shutters were drawn, and the cool interior offered respite from the sun's embrace. Lucius dozed lightly, his dreams filled with sun-drenched hills and the rhythm of the scythe through grain. Tiberius read from a small scroll, its Latin script, still difficult but fascinating nonetheless. Marcia hummed a soft tune as she spun wool, her hands ever moving, ever creating. As shadows lengthened, life resumed its gentle cadence. Lucius walked the orchard, checking fig trees and olive branches. He exchanged a wave with a neighbor passing by on a cart, their voices raised only briefly to share news of a new calf born down the road. These were the moments that wove their lives together, small exchanges, shared labors, and a sense of community that needed no proclamation. Toward evening, the family gathered near the hearth, where Marcia prepared a stew fragrant with lentils and herbs. Tiberius recited a story he'd memorized, and Lucius listened, offering praise and gentle corrections. The flames danced softly in the fading light, casting golden hues on the walls. As night fell, the stars appeared one by one, scattered across the sky like spilled grain. The countryside lay still, wrapped in a blanket of quietude. Lucius sat outside for a time, watching the constellations wheel above. He thought of his father and grandfather, who had once gazed at the same stars from the same land. There was a comfort in that continuity, a sense that life, though simple, was full. Before retiring, Lucius whispered a blessing to the land, a habit passed down through generations. He joined Marcia in their room, the silence between them as warm as any embrace. Tomorrow would bring the same peace, the same labors, and the same joy found in a day well lived. This is the beginning of their story. And as we move deeper into the life of Lucius and his family, let us take each step gently, each breath softly, and drift with them through the days and nights of ancient Rome's countryside. Morning came again, not with urgency, but with gentleness. A pale light crept slowly across the tiled floors of the villa, illuminating the faint outlines of woven baskets, clay vessels, and wooden stools. Birds announced the dawn with soft chirps, and a low mist hung over the fields like a silken shawl. Lucius stirred beneath his woolen blanket and sat up slowly, stretching his arms before reaching for his sandals. Another day awaited, not rushed, not burdensome, but simply present, like a friend quietly knocking at the door. In the kitchen, Marcia had already stirred the embers in the hearth to life. She was grinding barley for porridge, her hands steady, as ever. The scent of toasted grain and wild honey soon filled the house, and the warmth from the fire pushed back the early morning chill. A loaf of bread, risen overnight beneath a cloth, waited to be baked beside a clay dish of dried figs and goat cheese. The familiar rhythm of the morning grounded her, each movement purposeful, each sound as soft and reassuring as a lullaby. Tiberius yawned as he entered, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. He smiled at the scent of breakfast and quickly kissed his mother's cheek before settling on the bench. Marcia tousled his hair and handed him a warm cup of watered wine. Lucius joined them, his face lined with sleep but peaceful. They ate, together as a family, quietly savoring the start of another day. After breakfast, Lucius and Tiberius ventured out into the orchard, where the sun now lit the tops of the trees. The fig trees were heavy with fruit, and the pomegranate bushes showed hints of crimson through their green leaves. With baskets in hand, they worked side by side, gently twisting the ripest fruits free and placing them with care into woven carriers. Tiberius, ever inquisitive, asked about the roots and soil, about how long it took the trees to bear fruit, and why the bees gathered near certain blossoms, but not others. Lucius answered each question with calm delight. He believed deeply that knowledge should be shared like bread, offered freely and patiently. He showed his son the knots in the bark, the hidden nests of tiny birds, and the signs that told him a tree was strong or weary. They paused often to listen, to the wind, to the buzzing of insects, to the distant bleat of a neighbor's goat. By midday, the baskets were full, and their arms pleasantly tired. They returned to the villa, where Marcia had prepared a cooling dish of cucumber and yogurt, flavored with mint from the garden. They ate beneath the shade of the pergola, where grapevines coiled like lazy serpents around the wooden posts, casting soft patterns of shadow on their faces. Tiberius shared what he had learned that morning, his voice animated, and Lucius listened with pride. After lunch, as was their custom, the household rested. The shutters were drawn against the sun's strongest hours, and the house fell into a dreamy silence. Tiberius napped, curled with a soft cloth over his shoulder, while Marcia reclined with her spindle, slowly drawing out threads of wool into fine strands. Lucius sat on a stool near the window, gazing at the dusty light and thinking not of chores or tasks, but of nothing at all, just the comfort of stillness. As the heat faded, life resumed its gentle flow. Lucius brought a jug of water from the well and sprinkled it over the garden to settle the dust. Bees hovered lazily above the rosemary bushes. In the distance, a shepherd's flute echoed faintly, a lilting, melancholy tune that floated over the olive grove like a lullaby for the earth. Later, Lucius walked to the village market with Tiberius. They brought with them dried herbs and a clay jar of oil to trade. The road was quiet, lined with wildflowers and the occasional fig tree. Along the way, they greeted fellow villagers, each nod, each small exchange, part of the invisible web that held the community together. In the market square, under a linen canopy, a potter displayed his wares, and a weaver offered dyed cloth in soft, muted hues. Tiberius marveled at the baskets of almonds, the shimmering scales of freshly caught fish, and the small bronze charms shaped like laurel leaves. Lucius traded quietly and fairly. He accepted a small scroll of poetry in exchange for oil, and gave a nod of respect to an elderly widow who always brought fine honey to market. These moments, brief, warm, unhurried, gave shape to their lives in the same way that sunlight and rain shape the vines. As they walked home, the sky had begun to change, streaked now with rose and amber. Crickets began their chorus early, and the air cooled with the promise of evening. Tiberius carried the basket, proud to take part in the household's rhythm. Lucius pointed out a heron in the stream, and they stood for a moment just watching as it dipped its beak and stood motionless once more. Back at the villa, Marcia had lit a lamp, and the warm glow welcomed them home. She had prepared lentil, cakes and roasted vegetables with honeyed vinegar. They ate together, laughter slipping in among their words like wind through wheat. After the meal, Tiberius recited a line from the scroll, and Lucius offered gentle guidance on the pronunciation, while Marcia smiled at the beauty of it. As darkness fully embraced the countryside, Lucius stepped outside once more. The stars. Above were countless old friends watching over them from their eternal perches. He felt the cool stone beneath his feet, heard the rustle of olive branches, and once more whispered thanks to the land, the gods, and the simple blessings of the day. This was the Rome he cherished, not of marble and conquest, but of quiet, strength, steady love, and the deep, enduring peace of living close to the soil. Great. Here is the next part of the story. A day in ancient Rome. Peaceful life in the countryside. We continue with the same calm, immersive tone and steady pace, designed for sleep and relaxation. As the faintest light of morning seeped once again into the hills of the Roman countryside, a gentle mist clung to the earth like a silken veil. The scent of damp soil mixed with the sweetness of ripening figs, and from the edge of the vineyard, dew-beaded grape leaves glistened like emeralds beneath the early sun. In the stillness before the full awakening of day, Lucius stood near the rows of vines, his hand lightly resting on a wooden stake as he looked out over the rolling fields. This was his sanctuary, quiet, familiar, eternal. The vineyard had been in his family for generations. Each vine had a story. Each stone in the low boundary walls had once been lifted by a father or son. This land was not only home but memory, lineage, and promise. Lucius inspected the vines, his fingers brushing over the curling tendrils and tight green clusters that promised a fruitful harvest. The early morning was his time of reflection, a moment to walk the boundaries of his world and find peace in its steadfastness. Back at the villa, Marcia was already at work, kneading dough for the day's bread. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, and her brow glistened with the warmth of the kitchen. She worked with an ease that came from years of repetition, her hands strong and sure. A bowl of olives rested on the table, curing in brine, while a pot of lentils simmered slowly over the hearth. The household moved like a well-tuned lyre, every member in harmony with the next. Tiberius was in the courtyard, feeding the hens and scattering grain with a rhythmic sweep of his hand. He paused now and then to watch the birds peck eagerly at the ground, marveling at their simple contentment. He was beginning to take on more responsibility. Lucius had shown him how to harness the donkey the week before, and he'd be learning how to prune the vines come spring. Though still a child, Tiberius carried within him the spark of a man who would one day tend this same land. By the time the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shafts of golden light across the olive grove, the villa hummed with soft activity. Lucius sharpened his tools beneath the shade of an old fig tree, the rhythmic rasp of stone on blades soothing in its familiarity. He checked the plow, repaired a wooden yoke, and tightened the ropes that bound the bundles of kindling near the storage shed. Occasionally, a distant bell would ring out from the village, a soft chime that marked the passage of time. The villa was part of a wider community. Farmers, potters, weavers, and shepherds, each performing their own quiet rituals to keep life turning. Though the Roman Empire stretched far and wide, here, in this patch of earth among cypress and laurel, the world felt small and manageable. A neighbor arrived around midday, Gaius, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and a hearty laugh. He brought with him a basket of eggs and a scroll bearing news from the village elders. The two men spoke easily in the shade, sharing stories and thoughts on the weather, while Tiberius listened with interest, absorbing their words like sunlight. They spoke of planting schedules and the rumor of a new aqueduct being built beyond the hills. Marcia offered Gaius a bowl of warm bread and honey, which he accepted with gratitude. Their conversation flowed with ease, winding like the stream that traced the edge of Lucius's land. No urgency pressed them. The day allowed space to linger. Later, as the afternoon settled in, the family turned toward more delicate tasks. Tiberius helped Marcia gather herbs, basil, sage, and rosemary, from the garden. Together, they hung the fragrant bundles to dry beneath the eaves of the villa. Lucius, meanwhile, fetched clay jugs from the cellar to check the fermentation of last year's wine. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of aging grapes and damp stone, and he took his time inspecting each vessel with care. In these quiet hours, the villa felt like a world unto itself, one built on love, labor, and an unspoken trust that life would continue in its measured rhythm. A breeze stirred the linen curtains and sunlight filtered through in soft beams. Marcia hummed as she worked, her voice blending with the rustle of olive leaves and the cooing of doves. By early evening, the sun dipped lower, casting a golden hue across the hills. The family gathered once more beneath the pergola, this time with bowls of barley stew and slices of fresh bread. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, the quiet punctuated by gentle conversation and the occasional clink of pottery. As twilight deepened, Lucius told Tiberius stories of his own childhood, of the summer the river flooded, of the fox that once stole into the henhouse, of the ancient coins he'd found buried near the orchard. Tiberius listened wide-eyed, his mind painting images from his father's words. The stars emerged one by one, and the villa grew quiet again. Crickets began their nightly song, and the scent of lavender drifted from the garden. Marcia tucked a blanket around her son as he began to doze near the hearth, his curls resting against her arm. Lucius extinguished the last lamp, save for one, near the doorway, and stepped outside to look at the moon. He breathed in the night air, felt the earth cool beneath his bare feet, and whispered his nightly thanks to the gods for the simple abundance of the day. In this quiet, surrounded by those he loved, Lucius knew a kind of wealth that no Roman gold could buy. And so, the night passed, as softly as the breath of wind through the olive trees, and the house slept, wrapped in stillness and dreams. Wonderful. Here is the next part of A Day in Ancient Rome, peaceful life in the countryside. As always, we continue with a soft, steady pace and a tone crafted for relaxation and calm sleep. Morning came again, not with urgency, but with gentleness. A pale light crept slowly across the tiled floors of the villa, illuminating the faint outlines of woven baskets, clay vessels, and wooden stools. Birds announced the dawn with soft chirps, and a low mist hung over the fields like a silken shawl. Lucius stirred beneath his woolen blanket and sat up slowly, stretching his arms before reaching for his sandals. Another day awaited. Not rushed, not burdensome, but simply present, like a friend quietly knocking at the door. In the kitchen, Marcia had already stirred the embers in the hearth to life. She was grinding barley for porridge, her hands steady. As ever, the scent of toasted grain and wild honey soon filled the house, and the warmth from the fire pushed back the early morning chill. A loaf of bread, risen overnight beneath a cloth, waited to be baked beside a clay dish of dried figs and goat cheese. The familiar rhythm of the morning grounded her, each movement purposeful, each sound as soft and reassuring as a lullaby. Tiberius yawned as he entered, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. He smiled at the scent of breakfast and quickly kissed his mother's cheek before settling on the bench. Marcia tousled his hair and handed him a warm cup of watered wine. Lucius joined them, his face lined with sleep but peaceful. They ate, together as a family, quietly savoring the start of another day. After breakfast, Lucius and Tiberius ventured out into the orchard, where the sun now lit the tops of the trees. The fig trees were heavy with fruit, and the pomegranate bushes showed hints of crimson through their green leaves. With baskets in hand, they worked side by side, gently twisting the ripest fruits free and placing them with care into woven carriers. Tiberius, ever inquisitive, asked about the roots and soil, about how long it took the trees to bear fruit, and why the bees gathered near certain blossoms but not others. Lucius answered each question with calm delight. He believed deeply that knowledge should be shared like bread, offered freely and patiently. He showed his son the knots in the bark, the hidden nests of tiny birds, and the signs that told him a tree was strong or weary. They paused often to listen, to the wind, to the buzzing of insects, to the distant bleat of a neighbor's goat. By midday, the baskets were full and their arms pleasantly tired. They returned to the villa, where Marcia had prepared a cooling dish of cucumber and yogurt, flavored with mint from the garden. They ate beneath the shade of the pergola, where grapevines coiled like lazy serpents around the wooden posts, casting soft patterns of shadow on their faces. Tiberius shared what he had learned that morning, his voice animated, and Lucius listened with pride. After lunch, as was their custom, the household rested. The shutters were drawn against the sun's strongest hours, and the house fell into a dreamy silence. Tiberius napped, curled with a soft cloth over his shoulder, while Marcia reclined with her spindle, slowly drawing out threads of wool into fine strands. Lucius sat on a stool near the window, gazing at the dusty light and thinking not of chores or tasks, but of nothing at all, just the comfort of stillness. As the heat faded, life resumed its gentle flow. Lucius brought a jug of water from the well and sprinkled it over the garden to settle the dust. Bees hovered lazily above the rosemary bushes. In the distance, a shepherd's flute echoed faintly, a lilting, melancholy tune that floated over the olive grove like a lullaby for the earth. Later, Lucius walked to the village market with Tiberius. They brought with them dried herbs and a clay jar of oil to trade. The road was quiet, lined with wildflowers and the occasional fig tree. Along the way, they greeted fellow villagers, each nod, each small exchange, part of the invisible web that held the community together. In the market square, under a linen canopy, a potter displayed his wares, and a weaver offered dyed cloth in soft, muted hues. Tiberius marveled at the baskets of almonds, the shimmering scales of freshly caught fish, and the small bronze charms shaped like laurel leaves. Lucius traded quietly and fairly. He accepted a small scroll of poetry in exchange for oil, and gave a nod of respect to an elderly widow who always brought fine honey to market. These moments, brief, warm, unhurried, gave shape to their lives in the same way that sunlight and rain shape the vines. As they walked home, the sky had begun to change, streaked now with rose and amber. Crickets began their chorus early, and the air cooled with the promise of evening. Tiberius carried the basket, proud to take part in the household's rhythm. Lucius pointed out a heron in the stream, and they stood for a moment just watching as it dipped its beak and stood motionless once more. Back at the villa, Marcia had lit a lamp, and the warm glow welcomed them home. She had prepared lentil, cakes and roasted vegetables with honeyed vinegar. They ate together, laughter slipping in among their words like wind through wheat. After the meal, Tiberius recited a line from the scroll, and Lucius offered gentle guidance on the pronunciation, while Marcia smiled at the beauty of it. As darkness fully embraced the countryside, Lucius stepped outside once more, The stars. Above were countless old friends watching over them from their eternal perches. He felt the cool stone beneath his feet, heard the rustle of olive branches, and once more whispered thanks to the land, the gods, and the simple blessings of the day. This was the Rome he cherished, not of marble and conquest, but of quiet strength, steady love, and the deep, enduring peace of living close to the soil. Certainly. Continuing the story from where we left off. The first light of dawn once again broke over the Roman countryside, casting long golden rays through the mist that clung softly to the vineyards. The villa stirred slowly to life, not with urgency, but with the rhythm of routine. A quiet rustle of straw as Lucius rose from his bed, the familiar creak of the wooden floor beneath his feet, and the low murmur of animals waking in their pens were the only sounds that accompanied the morning. Lucius stepped outside, the cool earth beneath his sandals still damp from the night's dew. The olive trees whispered in the breeze, and far off, the song of a lark welcomed the day. He carried with him a small sack of feed for the chickens, scattering it with a practiced flick of the wrist as they clucked and pecked eagerly. A pig grunted nearby, nudging the gate, and Lucius chuckled softly before tossing it a handful of vegetable scraps saved from the evening meal. Today was a special day on the farm, a day of gathering and community. Twice a month, the nearby villagers would come together for a shared labor known as opus vicinorum, neighborly work. Each household took turns helping another with tasks too large to manage alone. And today, it was Lucius's turn to receive help with clearing a large patch of land he planned to turn into a second vineyard for his son. Marcia had already begun preparing food for the guests: flatbreads, soft cheese, stewed lentils, and sweet honey cakes. The scent drifted through the open windows, drawing Tiberius from his sleep. The boy was eager for the day, not only for the company it would bring, but because he was beginning to take real part in the work, his hands stronger and more skillful. With each passing season, as the sun climbed higher, neighbors began to arrive. Gaius and his brother Silvanus with their tools slung over their backs, old Petronia with her grandsons trailing behind her, and others from the outlying villas. They greeted Lucius with firm handshakes, warm smiles, and light-hearted jokes that had been passed down as long as the vines in their fields. Work began with laughter and effort in equal measure. Some cleared brush, others broke soil with wooden. Maddox and Tiberius, under Silvanus's watchful eye, helped carry away stones to line the edge of the field. Lucius moved among them all, lending a hand where needed, offering wine diluted with water to keep the workers refreshed, and ensuring that no one labored alone for long. By midday, sweat glistened on every brow, and laughter echoed across the fields. Marcia and Petronia laid out a long cloth beneath the shade of a fig tree, spreading food across its length as children darted in and out of the grown-ups' legs. They all gathered to eat, reclining on the grass, sharing stories between bites, speaking of the harvest, of the rains, of a new baby born in the next village over. Lucius looked around at the gathered faces, friends, family, neighbors, and felt a quiet pride swell within him. Not the pride of conquest or wealth, but of something more enduring, a life built with patience and care, surrounded by people who shared in both hardship and joy. When the meal ended, the work resumed at a gentler pace. The men and older boys finished clearing the patch of land, now nearly ready for the next planting season. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows and bathing the world in a soft, amber glow. The day's work came to a close not with fanfare, but with mutual nods, hand clasps, and promises of help returned when needed. As the last of the guests departed down the winding path, their figures shrinking into the warm haze of evening, Lucius stood at the edge of the field and looked at the earth now laid bare. Tiberius came to stand beside him, tired but smiling. "You did well today," Lucius said softly, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "So did you, father," the boy replied, his voice filled with both pride and admiration. They walked back to the villa together, the cicadas now beginning their nightly song, and the villa lights glowing like small stars in the encroaching dusk. Marcia met them at the door with cups of cool water, her eyes full of quiet joy. Later that evening, the three of them sat together by the fire, the night calm and still. Lucius polished his tools, Marcia mended a tunic, and Tiberius sketched rough outlines of what he dreamed the new vineyard would one day look like. It was in these quiet moments, free from distraction or worry, that their lives found the deepest meaning. Outside, the moon rose over the olive groves, casting soft silver light across the hills. The land was at rest, the people within the villa safe and content. And so ended another day in the countryside of ancient Rome, where each sunrise brought not just labor, but connection, where every sunset closed not just a chapter, but a blessing. Certainly, continuing the story. The following morning began as many others had, peacefully, quietly, with the sounds of birdsong drifting through the open windows and the soft creak of worn floorboards as Lucius moved about the house. Yet even within the familiar, there was something fresh about this day. Perhaps it was the faint scent of rain from the night before still clinging to the air, or the way the breeze gently fluttered the linen curtains. The earth smelled alive, rich and ready, and Lucius breathed deeply as he stepped into the courtyard. The rout, newly cleared land from yesterday's gathering glowed with potential under the rising sun. The earth had been turned and softened, ready to receive its future crop of young vines. Lucius stood there a moment, soaking in the quiet promise the land offered. Tiberius joined him, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and together they began the morning's work. Their task for the day was to prepare trellises for the vineyard to be, long wooden frames upon which the grapevines would one day grow. Lucius showed Tiberius how to drive the stakes evenly into the ground, ensuring they stood at proper intervals. The boy listened closely, copying his father's motions, asking the occasional question and smiling at every nod of approval. As the sun climbed, Marcia brought them water flavored with sprigs of mint and a plate of fresh figs, still warm from the morning sun. They rested beneath a tree, sharing the simple meal in companionable silence. It was these pauses, short moments, of stillness between labors, that marked the heartbeat of their life, calm, rhythmic, grounded. Later, Lucius took Tiberius to visit an elder farmer who lived further down the valley, an old friend named Flavius, who had once been a soldier. Before settling into a life of peaceful cultivation, Flavius's home was surrounded by high fig trees and neatly trimmed hedges, and the man greeted them with a firm handshake and a smile deepened by many seasons in the sun. Flavius was a man of many stories, and as they sat under his pergola sipping watered wine, he told tales of his youth, of distant provinces and far-off cities, of stormy seas and mountain passes. But more than that, he spoke of the land, of how to read the color of leaves to know what nutrients the soil lacked, of how to sense the coming of an early frost, and how to harvest olives at just the right time for pressing. Tiberius listened wide-eyed, soaking in every word. When they left, Flavius gave the boy a small carving knife, its handle worn smooth. "It's not much," he said with a wink, "but it's carved more vinewood than you can count. Take care. Fit, and it'll take care of you." On the walk home, Tiberius clutched the knife with reverence, and Lucius placed a hand on his shoulder. "One day, you'll have your own vineyard to tend, and you'll pass that knife on to your son." Evening brought a gentle rain, tapping softly against the roof tiles. Inside, Marcia lit the oil lamps, their warm glow dancing against the walls. She prepared a stew of barley, leeks, and dried meat, while Lucius and Tiberius dried off and changed into clean tunics. They sat by the hearth again, the room filled with the scent of herbs and the sound of rain, a lullaby for the land, a song for the soul. After dinner, Tiberius practiced his reading from a scroll he'd borrowed from the village teacher, an excerpt from Virgil's Georgics, fittingly about the life of a farmer. Lucius listened with quiet pride, correcting only gently when the boy stumbled on a difficult word. Marcia spun wool nearby, her rhythm steady, calming. As the night deepened, they moved to their beds. The villa hushed except for the rain's patter and the occasional call of a nightbird in the trees. Lucius looked out once more across his land, wet, dark, and glistening with promise, and whispered the same quiet blessing he always did before sleep. Another day in the countryside had passed, not extraordinary in any grand sense, but full in its own quiet way. The vines had not yet been planted, but their future had begun. The story of Lucius, Marcia, and Tiberius was not one of sudden events or great changes, but of the kind of life that weathers time like stone, unchanging in spirit, evolving in form, and always gently moving forward with the seasons. Of course, continuing the story, dawn arrived again, veiled in the soft gray of clouds lingering from the evening's rain. A light mist clung to the vineyard slope, and the dew on the grass sparkled as the first light of day pierced the veil. The birds returned with their morning songs, and in the villa, the rhythm of life stirred gently once more. Lucius opened the shutters to greet the fresh scent of the damp earth. Rain had made the soil tender, dark, and full of vitality, the perfect condition for planting. Tiberius, now more confident in his daily tasks, helped Marcia knead dough in the early morning while Lucius prepared the cuttings to be planted. The quiet hum of the house was punctuated by small bursts of laughter, gentle instructions, and the scraping of clay bowls. After breakfast, they moved together into the fields, their footsteps soft over the moist ground. It was time at last to begin the planting of their new vineyard. Lucius dug steadily, his hands working as if they had always belonged to the earth. Tiberius followed behind him, gently placing each young vine cutting into its place. Marcia, with a basket of straw mulch, covered the roots and pressed them in, sealing the new life into the soil. The work was methodical, repetitive, and yet deeply fulfilling. Each row laid was a promise, of shade in future summers, of harvests yet to come, of wine shared over stories and suppers. The neighbors came by in the late morning to lend a hand. Cassia, a friend of Marcia's, brought her 2 daughters, and together they worked and laughed, the vineyard becoming not only a place of cultivation but of communion. Even old Flavius made the slow walk up the path, bringing with him a small jug of seasoned olive oil and tales from his days in the legions, somehow always relevant to even the smallest moment. His presence, though aged and slower, added gravity to the day, a reminder that traditions were not just carried forward but shared. At midday they paused under the shade of the orchard. Marcia unpacked a cloth bundle of salted fish, olives, boiled eggs, and small honey cakes. The sun had returned in full by now, warming the damp earth and drawing up the scent of herbs and pine. They ate in peace, the children chasing one another through the olive trees while the adults rested and shared quiet conversation. As the afternoon deepened, so did the furrows in the field. More vines found their homes in the welcoming earth, and by evening the first section of the vineyard was fully planted. The family stood together at its edge, tired but content, gazing at the neat rows stretching across the slope. It was not yet, but it was the beginning of something enduring. Back at the villa, the routine turned once more to evening rest. Tiberius read aloud again, his voice gaining confidence. Tonight he chose a passage about the myths of Bacchus, god, of wine and revelry, which earned a laugh from Lucius and a playful nudge from Marcia. The hearth crackled with new fire, and the room, warmed by both flame and family, became a sanctuary against the encroaching night. Later, as Lucius stood again at the door, the stars greeted him like old companions. He traced the familiar constellations with his eyes, Orion, Taurus, and beyond, each a guide, a marker, and a witness to the steady unfolding of their lives. The vines were planted, the soil watered with labor and care. Now they would grow. He whispered his nightly blessing and joined Marcia beneath the linen covers where silence was comfort, and dreams waited just beyond the edge of waking. Tomorrow the sun would rise again, and so too would they. Of course, continuing the story, the next morning broke with a mellow warmth, the kind that promised a long and gentle day ahead. Insects buzzed lazily around the blossoms, and the villa basked in golden sunlight, its stones still holding the coolness of night. Lucius awoke to the scent of rosemary and simmering porridge. Marcia had already risen and begun her preparations for the day, moving softly through the house with the graceful familiarity of someone who had made the same motions for many years. Tiberius sat nearby, eyes still drowsy, scribbling letters onto a wax tablet. His father ruffled his hair as he passed, noting the boy's growing confidence in his writing. After breakfast, they once again took to the vineyard, now a space of hope and care, where tender shoots poked up from the damp earth, stretching for the sun. Lucius inspected each row, bending to adjust a tie here, brush away a stray weed there. His hands moved slowly, reverently, as if each vine were a fragile treasure. Marcia arrived with a basket of newly cut herbs to plant between the rows: lavender, thyme, and rue, chosen not only for their scents and uses but for the way they attracted helpful insects and repelled pests. This interweaving of plants formed a quiet harmony, a companion planting born not from manuals, but from the wisdom of generations. As they worked side by side, Tiberius brought laughter into their midst with questions about whether the vines would listen if spoken to, and if wine could carry stories from the soil. At mid-morning, a soft bell rang from the road, a traveling merchant with goods for trade. Lucius and Tiberius walked to greet him, passing through fields humming with bees. The merchant, a wiry man, with a pleasant grin and dust on his sandals, offered salted fish from the coast, small carved charms from Etruria, and woven linens from further south. After exchanging goods, some olive oil and dried figs from the villa, they returned with a bolt of deep blue cloth and a new wooden comb for Marcia. In the afternoon, a visiting cousin arrived from a neighboring village. Julia, a bright woman, with a sharp tongue and kind eyes, brought stories of local news: a successful harvest festival, a calf born under unusual stars, a baker who had taken to reciting poetry as he kneaded his dough. The family welcomed her eagerly, and for a while the villa echoed with conversation and laughter. They gathered under the pergola for a shared meal as the sun lowered. The food was simple yet satisfying: lentil stew, crusty bread, marinated, olives, and a dish of stewed apricots. The quiet joy of full stomachs and familiar faces was its own kind of wealth. As twilight crept across the sky, Lucius poured a small amount of last year's wine into clay cups. They drank slowly, toasting to the new vineyard and the old friendships that sustained them. When night fell, and Julia had gone to rest in the guest room, Lucius once again took his place under the stars. Tonight he lingered a little longer, thinking about the rows of vines growing quietly behind the villa, about the way life unfolded in cycles: birth, growth, rest, and renewal. He thought, too, of how fortunate they were to be woven into that rhythm, to live by it, and to pass it on. A whisper of wind passed through the olive trees, like a voice from the land itself, soft and reassuring. He stood for a moment, listening, not just to the sound, but to the stillness beneath it. The morning that followed was unusually quiet. A gentle mist lay across the vineyard, curling around the base of the vines and weaving itself through the orchard. It was the kind of morning that made sound travel softly, as if the entire countryside were taking a breath. Lucius stood on the threshold of the villa, his hands wrapped around a warm cup of barley tea, and watched the fog drift slowly upward. The dew on the leaves caught the first rays of the sun and turned them into glistening gems, scattered across the earth like offerings to the gods. Tiberius joined him shortly, his tunic rumpled, eyes half-lidded with sleep, but his curiosity intact. "Does the land dream when it's quiet like this?" he asked, leaning against the wooden post beside his father. Lucius smiled, sipped his tea, and nodded. "Perhaps. Maybe it dreams of spring rains, or of the footsteps of those who once walked this path long before us." Tiberius said nothing more, but the thought lingered between them, like incense hanging in still air. The family spent the early part of the day clearing stones from the far field, a slow, meditative task that brought them out into the open air, and under the soft gaze of a sky still streaked with the last traces of morning mist. Lucius remembered stories of his grandfather doing the same work, hands calloused, eyes always watching the horizon for weather, or for news, or for the quiet changes that signaled the next turn of the season. As they worked, a pair of birds danced through the air, their calls crisscrossing in a musical dialogue. Marcia pointed them out, remarking on how one had nested in the eaves of the villa for the past 2 years. "They always return," she said, and there was something gentle and comforting in the certainty of that. When the sun reached its zenith, they took their rest once more beneath the shaded pergola. Julia, still visiting, had prepared a cool salad of barley, beans, and crushed mint leaves, served alongside figs and slices of soft cheese. The meal passed with the rhythm of long familiarity, shared stories, soft laughter, a few quiet moments where no words were needed. Lucius watched his family with a calm heart. This, he knew, was the life he had always hoped for, not one of riches or acclaim, but one of peace, rootedness, and the enduring beauty of shared days. Later, Tiberius helped Lucius reinforce the fencing around the goat pen, a simple but necessary task. The boy worked diligently, learning not just the how, but the why. Why a post must be set at a certain depth, why the grain of the wood mattered, and why one should always check twice for wear and rot. These were the lessons not found in scrolls or grand speeches, but in the repetition of quiet days and steady hands. Lucius took pride in passing them down. As evening fell, clouds gathered low in the sky. A soft rain began to patter across the tiled roof, gentle and melodic. Inside the villa, the family gathered around the hearth once more. The fire crackled, and the scent of simmering lentils filled the room. Julia shared a tale from her youth, a story of a wandering scholar who taught children letters in exchange for shelter and bread. Tiberius was captivated, eyes wide as he imagined such a traveler arriving at their gate. Lucius watched his son, a deep affection stirring in his chest. He saw in Tiberius not just a child, but the continuation of everything he and Marcia had built. The future, sitting cross-legged by the fire, soaking in stories like the earth soaks in the rain. As the fire dimmed and the rain continued its quiet rhythm, the villa became a world unto itself, safe, warm, alive with the soft murmur of voices and the steady breath of those within. Lucius lay awake for a while that night, the roof's gentle dripping lulling him toward sleep. He thought about the vineyard, the fields, the rhythms of life that circled back again and again, and he felt, in that moment, perfectly content. Certainly. Continuing the story, morning light spilled softly through the woven curtains as the rain clouds of the previous night drifted away, leaving behind a sky scrubbed clean and air filled with the rich scent of damp earth. The vineyard glistened with raindrops clinging to tender leaves, and tiny rivulets traced paths down the stone walls of the villa. Inside, the quiet stillness of the early hour was broken only by the slow creak of wooden shutters and the gentle crackle of embers in the hearth, kept warm through the night. Lucius was the first to rise, as always, his body accustomed to the cadence of rural life. He dressed quietly, careful not to wake Marcia, and stepped out into the courtyard where the stone tiles glistened wet under his sandals. The morning held a sacred stillness after the rain, as if the land itself were drawing a breath of gratitude. Lucius moved slowly, deliberately, checking the state of the orchard, the goat pen, and the vineyard, all of which had been refreshed by the evening's showers. By the time Tiberius awoke and padded sleepily into the kitchen, Marcia was all ready, kneading dough for the day's bread, her movements fluid and practiced. The scent of yeast filled the room, mingling with that of the herbs she'd crushed earlier for a stew that would simmer slowly all day. Lucius returned from his rounds, just as she was placing the first loaf near the hearth to rise, and the three sat down to a warm bowl of porridge sweetened with figs. Later in the morning, they received a visitor, an old friend named Gaius, a retired legionary who had once served in the north and now lived a short ride away, keeping bees and occasionally assisting at the local shrine. He brought with him a jar of golden honey and tales of a recent festival in a neighboring village. His arrival was met with joy and familiarity, and they sat under the pergola, sharing food and stories as the sun slowly climbed above the hills. Gaius told tales of temples in distant cities, but always circled back to the peace of their region, to the quiet charm of a life shaped not by war or conquest, but by harvests and hearth fires. Tiberius listened intently, asking questions, his imagination catching fire once again. Marcia served the honey with fresh bread, and the soft murmur of conversation blended with the rustling of leaves and the distant chime of a shepherd's bell. After Gaius left, Lucius and Tiberius walked together to the edge of the property, where wild grasses grew tall and bees danced from blossom to blossom. They spoke of planting new olive trees there in the coming season. Tiberius, full of questions and ideas, eagerly suggested a small grove of fruit trees as well. Lucius nodded thoughtfully, listening, imagining the land not as it was, but as it might be, shaped by hands younger than his own, bearing fruit he might never see. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, the family worked together on tasks both big and small. Marcia mended a torn tunic while humming an old tune. Lucius cleaned and sharpened his tools beneath the shade of the fig tree. Tiberius practiced writing in the dirt with a stick, forming each letter slowly, calling out the names of philosophers and poets he'd heard about from Julia. The simplicity of the day held a kind of deep joy, wrapped in the small rituals that marked the passage of time. As the sun dipped toward the west, casting long golden shadows across the land, they prepared for the evening meal. Tonight it would be shared not just with family but with neighbors, a small gathering that happened once or twice each month, when the harvest permitted and the weather was kind. Children played near the stream while adults arranged benches and clay dishes under the open sky. The feast was modest. Roasted lentils, bread, honey, olives, and a jug of the family's wine passed hand to hand. Stories were told again, some familiar, some new, and laughter rose in warm waves. Tiberius recited a poem he'd memorized, stumbling over a few words, but beaming with pride as Lucius clapped him on the back. One of the elders shared a tale about the constellations above, pointing skyward as night deepened and stars emerged, steady and ancient. Later, as the fire burned low and families began their goodbyes, Lucius stood with Marcia, arms lightly brushing, watching the guests depart. Down moonlit paths, he could feel the tiredness in his bones, but it was a comforting kind of fatigue, earned and welcome. Back inside, the villa glowed with the soft flicker of oil lamps. Tiberius, curled beneath a wool blanket, had already drifted to sleep, his breath slow and even. Lucius lingered for a while longer by the open window, listening to the chirp of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Life here was not marked by monumental changes, but by the quiet progression of days filled with meaning, each one a thread in the larger tapestry of their existence. And in that stillness, with Marcia resting peacefully nearby and the night gently wrapping itself around their home, Lucius gave thanks to the land, to the ancestors, and to the simple grace of another day lived well. The next morning arrived with the soft cooing of doves in the rafters and the pale glow of dawn spilling over the hills. Lucius rose with a practiced ease, his steps soundless across the stone floor. Outside, mist hovered low over the fields, casting a veil of silver across the earth. The scent of dew on herbs filled the air as he opened the wooden shutters and looked out over the land that had shaped his life, and that he, in turn, had shaped with his own hands. This day was one of minor festival, a local celebration of Fortuna, the goddess of luck and plenty. Though not one of the grand religious holidays marked in the Roman calendar, it held special meaning in the countryside. For farmers like Lucius, fortune meant fertile soil, timely rain, and the healthy birth of livestock. The temple in the village would host a small gathering, with offerings of bread, wine, and fresh produce from the land. Marcia was already awake, carefully preparing a woven basket filled with gifts, a bundle of rosemary and sage, a few figs, a folded cloth embroidered with the image of Fortuna, and a small jar of honey. She worked with reverence, her hands moving steadily, respectfully, as if she could shape the goddess's favor through the grace of her own motions. Tiberius, half-dressed, and, struggling with his sandals, asked questions about the meaning of the day. Lucius knelt to help him tie the straps, explaining gently that offerings were not bribes, but gestures of gratitude and humility, acknowledgments that nature's bounty was never fully within their control. Together, the family made their way along the sunlit path to the village. It was a short walk through olive groves and gently sloping fields, and the road soon filled with others, neighbors, distant cousins, merchants, and children running ahead with laughter echoing behind them. The small temple near the village square had been adorned with laurel branches, and its modest altar was already dusted with flour and flower petals. Priests in clean white robes chanted softly as each family laid down their offerings. Lucius placed their basket before the altar and bowed his head in silence. Behind him, Marcia whispered a quiet prayer, and Tiberius gazed wide-eyed at the ritual, his hand slipping into his father's. The villagers gathered in loose clusters afterward, sharing bread and wine, exchanging kind words, and enjoying the temporary pause from labor. It was not a day of indulgence but of gentle celebration, a communal acknowledgement of the delicate balance that sustained them all. As the sun climbed, the village grew livelier. Musicians played soft tunes on lyres and flutes, while children danced barefoot in the dust. Lucius chatted with old friends about the harvest ahead, the weather's temperamental behavior, and the birth of a neighbor's twins. Marcia traded herb cuttings with a fellow healer, and Tiberius listened with fascination as an elderly man told a tale of an eagle that had once stolen a loaf of bread right from a baker's window. By midday, the family returned home, pleasantly tired, the warm glow of the festival still clinging to their cheeks. They ate simply, roasted chickpeas, pickled vegetables, and fruit, and then rested during the heat of the afternoon. Tiberius napped in the shade of the fig tree, clutching a small wooden toy gifted by another boy, while Marcia wove dried herbs into bundles that would later be hung above the hearth. As evening descended, bringing with it a cool breeze scented with pine, Lucius took out the scroll he had been slowly reading over the past several weeks. Though not a scholar, he found peace in the practice of slow reading, of tracing lines of verse that echoed thoughts he rarely voiced. This one spoke of the seasons, of time as a river, and of the constancy of the stars overhead. He read aloud a few lines to Marcia as she spun wool nearby. Her fingers never stopped their motion, but she smiled at the sound of his voice. Later that night, as they sat near the hearth with its quiet embers still glowing, Lucius spoke of planting more barley in the western plot, and perhaps building a small shed near the stream to store tools. Marcia nodded, her thoughts already imagining the woven baskets she'd make for carrying grain. Tiberius, drowsy but trying to stay awake, asked if they could teach a lamb to carry messages like in the story he'd heard earlier. Lucius chuckled softly and assured him that lambs made poor messengers but excellent companions. Before bed, they stepped outside once more. The sky was dazzling, clear, open, and spangled with stars. The Milky Way stretched above like a river of light. Lucius pointed out Orion's belt to Tiberius, who tried to trace the shapes with his fingers in the air. Somewhere in the distance a night bird called, and the world seemed to pause, wrapped in stillness. Lucius placed a hand on his son's shoulder, firm and steady. "One day," he said gently, "you'll walk these fields as I have, and perhaps your son will walk them after you. But always remember to look up. The land will teach you much, but the sky reminds us where we came from." They lingered a while longer, savoring the hush of the countryside, the comfort of shared silence, and the closeness of family. When they returned indoors, the villa felt like a warm cocoon, secure and steady, untouched by time. As sleep claimed them one by one, the olive trees whispered in the breeze outside, and the villa settled into its night rhythm, a pulse of peace, in the heart of ancient Rome. Of course, here is the continuation. The next day began with the same soft rhythm that defined their lives, but with a subtle difference. Tiberius had risen before Lucius, and was already outside, crouched by the stream, with a stick tracing shapes in the mud and watching tiny fish dart between pebbles. Lucius, stepping quietly into the early light, paused at the doorway, smiling at the image of his son so absorbed in thought. He recalled his own boyhood spent in that very spot, when the stream had seemed a great river, and each day a grand expedition. They had planned to begin pruning the olive trees today, a task both meditative and essential. The yield from each tree depended not just on the richness of the soil or the kindness of the weather, but on the careful hands that tended them. Lucius believed there was a kind of dialogue between farmer and tree, an understanding built over years, like an old friendship. Marcia joined them later, bringing bread and cheese in a small basket, and the three of them worked in quiet companionship, moving from tree to tree under the rising sun. As they worked, Lucius found himself humming, an old tune his father used to sing during the harvest. The melody floated lightly through the air, and soon Marcia's soft voice picked up the words. Even Tiberius, still learning the lyrics, joined in where he could, laughing at his own mistakes. In those simple harmonies, surrounded by the groves, their ancestors had once walked. The day unfolded like a poem. At midday, they returned to the villa and rested in the cool atrium. Lucius took the time to sharpen tools and oil the handles, his motions deliberate and slow. Marcia sorted dried herbs into ceramic jars, labeling each with practiced care, while Tiberius attempted to carve a small animal from a scrap of wood. He concentrated deeply, tongue between his teeth, completely unaware of the soft pride in his parents' eyes. Later that afternoon, an old friend and neighbor, Gaius, arrived with his teenage daughter Livia. They brought with them a large loaf of barley bread and news from the nearby town. A traveling poet would be performing at the Forum in 2 days' time. Gaius, always fond of storytelling, hoped Lucius would accompany him. It had been years since Lucius had attended such a gathering, but the idea stirred something within him. Marcia gently encouraged him, reminding him that the land would still be there tomorrow and that sometimes the soul also needed tending. They shared a small meal together, beneath the pergola, and Gaius reminisced about their younger days, about muddy races through the vineyards and summer nights spent trying to catch fireflies. Livia and Tiberius listened in wonder, their minds painting pictures of those past adventures. As the guests departed, Lucius promised to join them at the Forum, a rare outing that Tiberius begged to attend as well. That evening, the family moved through their evening rituals with even more tenderness than usual. Marcia lit a lamp scented with crushed lavender. Lucius stoked the hearth with care. Tiberius, unusually thoughtful, asked what it meant to be remembered, not just by family, but by others. Lucius considered this a moment and replied, "It means living well, living gently, leaving behind something that makes the world softer, quieter, better." Tiberius nodded, absorbing the words like sunlight. Before sleep, they stood once again outside under the stars. The night sky, clear and deep, seemed to echo with ancient wisdom. Lucius pointed out Venus, shining brightly in the west, and told his son how sailors once used its light to find their way home. "Even when lost," he said, "there's always something above to guide you." The stars shimmered silently in response, and the family lingered there, wrapped in warmth and presence. The days leading up to the trip to the Forum passed slowly, like warm honey sliding down an amphora. The rhythm of the farm remained uninterrupted. There were olives to press, goats to milk, and the ever-present care of the vineyard. Yet beneath it all, there was a quiet excitement that shimmered just beneath the surface, particularly for Tiberius, who had never ventured beyond the immediate countryside. His questions were endless. What would the poet look like? Would there be music? Would there be food stalls with figs dipped in honey? Or spiced wine like he had once overheard his uncle describing? Lucius, though more reserved, found himself anticipating the outing with a kind of subdued joy. It had been many years since he had felt the pull of the greater world beyond his fields. He didn't miss the noise or the politics of the city, but there was something deeply human about hearing another's voice telling stories by firelight. The idea of sitting with others under the open sky, surrounded by laughter and words shaped into verse, it stirred memories of youth, of days when he believed his own name might one day be sung in a story. On the morning of the gathering, Marcia rose before the sun to prepare a small parcel of food for the journey. Flatbread wrapped in cloth, soft cheese, dried figs, and a skin of cool water. She packed it with care, slipping in a sprig of rosemary. "For luck," she said with a smile. Lucius and Tiberius dressed in clean tunics, and though their sandals were well worn, their spirits were light. They said their goodbyes, promised to return by nightfall, and set off with Gaius and Livia as the mist lifted from the fields. The road to the Forum wound gently through olive groves and wheat fields, skirting the edges of other villas and small farms. Along the way, they encountered others making the same journey, neighbors and strangers alike, nodding in quiet greeting. Tiberius was wide-eyed, taking in every turn of the path, every accent he heard, every unfamiliar face. When they arrived at the town's edge, Lucius was struck by how little and how much had changed. The stone buildings bore the same carved cornices, the same mosaic floors he remembered from boyhood visits, yet now they felt smaller somehow. Not diminished, but more human, more intimate than the towering impressions he had held as a child. The Forum bustled with quiet anticipation. Traders displayed simple wares, woven baskets, dyed cloth, amphorae of oil, and the scent of roasted chickpeas and honeyed nuts wafted through the air. At the heart of it all stood a low wooden platform, freshly built, surrounded by benches and rugs where townsfolk had already begun to gather. Tiberius insisted they sit close, and Lucius obliged. Gaius greeted old acquaintances. Livia shared bread with a girl she knew from market. And then, as the sun began its slow descent, the poet appeared. He was not what Tiberius had expected. No gleaming robes or laurel crowns, but a weathered man with lines like parchment around his eyes, and a voice like the river after rain. Calm, deep, carrying. He did not shout or gesture wildly. Instead, he spoke as though to a friend across the table, spinning stories of heroes and lovers, of farmers and fishermen, of gods who whispered through fig leaves and winds that carried secrets across oceans. And the people listened, unmoving, as though caught in a spell. Lucius, too, was transported. One tale in particular of a shepherd who had lived his entire life tending sheep on a hillside and who, in old age, discovered he had been guarding a sacred grove struck him deeply. It was not a story of grandeur, but of quiet purpose, of meaning found not in recognition, but in devotion to simple things. He looked at Tiberius, who was leaning forward with eyes wide and heart open, and felt something warm and indescribable rise within him. When the performance ended, the crowd lingered. Some offered coins, others praise. The poet accepted both with humility, and when Tiberius approached shyly and said, "Thank you, sir," the man smiled and placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Tell your own stories one day," he said. "The world will need them." The journey home was quieter. The stars appeared one by one, and the road seemed shorter under their familiar light. Tiberius walked in thoughtful silence, while Lucius and Gaius shared soft laughter and remembered lines from the poems they had heard. When they reached the villa, Marcia welcomed them with warm stew and a gentle embrace. She listened to their stories, smiled at their excitement, and later, as they lay together in the stillness of their room, she whispered to Lucius, "You should tell your story someday too." Lucius, resting with his hand over hers, replied softly, "Maybe I already am." Each day, outside the cicadas sang, and the moon bathed the vineyard in silver light. Another day would come, full of labor, light, and gentle joys. But for now, they slept deeply, hearts full beneath the timeless sky. Of course, here's the continuation of the story. The morning after the gathering was quieter than most, the kind of calm that follows deep reflection. Lucius awoke early, as always, but there was a thoughtful air to his movements. He paused longer than usual, by the small altar in the courtyard where he often left a sprig of lavender or a bit of grain for the household gods. Today, he placed the sprig gently, bowed his head and whispered a few words not just of thanks but of intention. An old habit awakened anew. Tiberius too seemed changed, as though the poetry of the night before had opened some unseen window within him. He followed Lucius more attentively through the morning routines, asked deeper questions, and spoke softly, as if not to disturb the lingering echoes of the poet's words. "Do you think I could write like that one day?" he asked as they spread grain for the chickens. Lucius smiled, kneeling beside him. "You already are in your heart. Writing is only one way of telling stories." The day unfolded gently, as most days did. Yet there was an undercurrent now, an almost imperceptible shift in the household. Marcia hummed a new melody as she kneaded bread, and even the goats seemed unusually docile as Tiberius milked them. When the noon sun hung above the cypress trees, the family gathered under the shade of the pergola, and Lucius, usually a man of few spoken words, surprised them all by recounting one of the poet's tales in his own way. It was not dramatic or ornate, but there was honesty in his telling, a grounding in the soil he so intimately knew. Tiberius listened, rapt. Marcia's eyes gleamed. And when Lucius finished, there was a pause filled with something sacred, appreciation, connection. That evening, Lucius took a small tablet of wax from an old chest and scratched out the first few lines of a story about a farmer and a vine that refused to grow until it heard a human voice. He chuckled softly at the idea, but he didn't stop. He wrote more that night after the others had gone to sleep, guided by the quiet rhythm of the crickets outside and the steady flicker of the oil lamp. The next few days brought a blend of the familiar and the new. Tasks remained the same. Harvesting figs, repairing a cracked gatepost, brushing olive leaves free of dust, but they carried a deeper awareness. Lucius found joy in narrating the small events of the day as if they were grand stories. The brave rooster who challenged a curious fox at dawn, the storm that passed without a drop of rain but left the scent of wild mint in the air. Tiberius began keeping his own little scroll of observations, asking for help with spelling and grammar in the evenings. Word spread in the village about the forum gathering. Others spoke of the poet's visit, but more than that, they began to share their own tales. A neighbor recounted the story of a fig tree planted by his grandmother that still bore fruit sweet as honey. Another recalled a storm from his youth and how it changed the shape of the river bend. The air was full of stories now, woven into the fabric of the everyday. One afternoon, while visiting the nearby villa of an elder named Servilia, a widow, known for her wisdom and her garden of herbs, Lucius and Tiberius shared their newfound interest in storytelling. Servilia smiled knowingly and disappeared into her small study, returning with a bundle of scrolls. "These belong to my husband," she said. "He loved the words of Ennius and Catullus. Perhaps they'll inspire you too." Tiberius clutched them like treasure, eyes wide, and Lucius bowed deeply in thanks. Back home, the evenings grew even more cherished. The family now spent time not just by the hearth, but with scrolls open and ideas shared. Marcia began to teach Tiberius the songs her grandmother once sang during harvest time, songs filled with rhythm, rhyme, and memories. Lucius continued to write in his quiet way, sometimes reading aloud a passage here or there, testing the flow of his sentences like he once tested soil for planting. A moon passed, then another. The vineyard began to show signs of ripening, and preparations for the grape harvest began. The air thickened with the scent of fruit and sun-baked stone. But in the midst of all the work, the habit of storytelling never faded. In fact, it grew, stronger, intertwined with daily life like ivy on the villa walls. One evening, as the family and a few neighbors gathered to celebrate the first pressing of grapes, Lucius stood up with a clay cup in his hand and cleared his throat. The conversations quieted, and he began to tell a tale, this time not one borrowed but one entirely his own. It was simple, about a farmer who fell in love with a star that visited his field each night in the form of a glowing dove. But in his telling, the field came alive. The dove shimmered, and the hearts of the listeners stirred with wonder. When he finished, there was silence, then warm applause, soft claps and knowing nods, the kind that come from feeling deeply seen. Marcia kissed his cheek. Tiberius beamed, and Lucius, ever humble, simply said, "Thank you. Stories are better when shared." And so the life of this modest Roman family continued, full of work, of harvests and seasons and shifting skies, but now also full of stories. Not stories that distracted from life, but ones that deepened it, like water soaking into thirsty soil. They learned that storytelling wasn't about becoming poets or scribes, but about honoring the quiet beauty of the everyday, the passing glance, the memory of a scent, the comfort of a voice in the dark. And through it all, the stars still shone above, ever watching, ever ancient, as Lucius and his family wrote their own humble legacy across the parchment of time. The days shortened gently as the sun began to shift its path across the sky, signaling the slow approach of autumn. The air turned a little crisper each morning, and the birds, once so lively at dawn, began their songs later, softer, as if knowing the season called for a gentler tone. In the fields, the grapevines were heavy with fruit, their clusters deep violet and green, almost glowing in the golden light. It was time. Harvest in the countryside was always a sacred time, not just for the abundance it brought, but for the way it gathered everyone together. Neighbors visited more frequently, helping one another with baskets, with pressing, with laughter shared under the ripening sky. In Lucius's villa, the preparations were steady but unhurried. He believed in working with the rhythm of nature, never rushing the process, always observing the signs the earth offered. Tiberius, now a little taller than the summer before, helped tie the woven baskets together while humming one of Marcia's harvest tunes. His hands, once uncertain, moved with more confidence. He asked fewer questions now, not because he was less curious, but because he had begun to understand the answers on his own. Yet when he did ask, Lucius was always there, offering quiet wisdom as they worked side by side, the vines brushing their shoulders. Marcia prepared bread and stews in greater quantity, welcoming visiting neighbors who came to lend their hands. The hearth glowed from early morning until long after sunset. The smell of baking mingled with crushed grapes and fresh-turned soil. The household was alive in every corner, yet the atmosphere remained tranquil, like a song played in a soothing rhythm. One evening, after a long day of harvesting, the family and a few neighbors gathered near the vineyard. They sat on low stools, the children lying in the grass, faces turned toward the rising moon. Tiberius brought out one of the scrolls gifted by Servilia and read aloud, his voice still young but filled with earnestness. The poem was short, a reflection on the simplicity of labor and the joy of shared meals. When he finished, no one applauded. They simply nodded, letting the words settle like dew. Lucius, watching his son by firelight, felt something stir deep within, a mix of pride, memory, and something quieter. Not ambition, but a peace that came from seeing his life echo forward. That night, after the guests had gone and the villa grew still, he wrote again by lamp's glow. He didn't write of grand tales or mythical creatures. He wrote of the day, of the way the grapes felt between his fingers, of his son's voice echoing beneath the trees. As the harvest drew to a close, the grape press filled barrel after barrel, and the sweet, rich scent of wine lingered in the air long after the work was done. It was then that Lucius suggested something unexpected. He proposed hosting another gathering, this time not just for neighbors, but for anyone in the nearby countryside who wished to share a story, a song, a memory. The idea was met with warmth. Word spread along the dusty roads and through olive groves, from potters and shepherds and traders passing through. By the following week, on an evening washed in soft lavender light, people began to arrive. Some brought fruit, others simple flutes carved from reeds. A few brought scrolls, others only the stories they carried in their hearts. Lucius opened the evening with a welcome, not grand or formal, but heartfelt. Then, one by one, voices rose into the quiet, filling the night with stories of love lost and found, of strange dreams and remembered ancestors, of fields that had grown wild, and children who had followed foxes into the hills. No one judged. No one hurried. Even the stars seemed to linger above the gathering, curious and content. Tiberius, encouraged by the warmth, shared one of his own tales, a story about a lost sandal that traveled across fields and rivers and finally returned home by the beak of a bird. The children laughed with delight. The adults smiled at the whimsy, touched by the lightness it brought to their hearts. Later that night, after farewells were exchanged and the last torch had been extinguished, Lucius sat in the stillness of the courtyard, the winepress silent, the earth quiet. Marcia joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Neither spoke. The peace of the evening wrapped around them like a familiar cloak. The world, vast and unpredictable, seemed small for a moment, small and kind and full of listening. And so life moved forward. The seasons would continue to shift. The olives would ripen. The wheat would sprout once more, and new children would run through the rows of vines. But now, interwoven with the rhythm of planting and reaping, was the rhythm of storytelling, a tradition reborn not in palaces or libraries, but in the hands of farmers, at the hearths of villas, beneath the ever-turning sky. If you're still listening and your eyes have grown heavy with the images of gentle days and whispering nights, let this moment linger a while longer. Breathe in the peace of a life lived slowly, loved deeply, and remembered in the hush of starlight. Winter arrived gently in the Roman countryside. It did not crash down with violence, but tiptoed in, lacing the mornings with mist and making the hearth a more welcoming place. The vines, once bursting with fruit, now rested beneath frost-dusted leaves. The olive trees stood silent and watchful, their gnarled limbs embracing the stillness of the cold season. Life slowed. The pace of the farm grew softer still, and within the walls of Lucius's villa, a deeper sense of contentment took root. Inside, the rhythm of the family remained, shaped now by firelight and woolen cloaks, by long evenings and stories retold by the hearth. Tiberius spent more time reading, growing more confident with each line of Latin. His favorite scroll was one about the life of a philosopher who lived alone on a hill, speaking only when necessary, choosing silence as his companion. He didn't always understand it, but something about the stillness of that man appealed to him. Lucius noticed and smiled quietly, recognizing in his son the stirrings of thoughtfulness that would serve him well in any path. Marcia, meanwhile, baked more frequently, spiced cakes made with dried fruit and warm honey, flatbreads crisped on the hearth. Her herbs now hung in bunches along the walls, drying slowly, their fragrance a reminder of the life sleeping beneath the soil. She hummed, often the same soft tune that once lulled Tiberius to sleep as a baby. Now it simply warmed the air, wrapping the family in its invisible thread. Neighbors visited less often during the cold months, but when they did, it was with baskets of nuts, cured meats, and warm smiles. One such evening, Servilia returned, her face ruddy from the wind, her hands clutching a gift, another scroll, this one filled with simple fables. She and Marcia exchanged knowing glances, both women grounded in the same shared strength, forged by years of tending not just land, but the inner gardens of patience and love. The villa's interior became the world. Days passed in simple acts, mending garments, spinning wool, preparing the soil in clay pots for early seedlings. Evenings were marked by candlelight, the flickering flame casting soft shadows on plaster walls. Lucius took to writing more during these months, recording the small moments. How the wind sighed through the shutters, how the goat had nuzzled his hand unexpectedly, how Tiberius had stared at the fire for a long time, and then spoken a quiet truth about the stars. One particularly cold night, when the air outside felt sharper than usual, Lucius brought the family together not for a chore, but for something new. He had carved a simple board and small playing pieces from olive wood, and introduced a game he remembered from his own childhood. Nothing complex, just a way of passing time with laughter and gentle competition. Tiberius was enthralled, and even Marcia, who rarely indulged in such pastimes, allowed herself the lightness of play. Their laughter, soft and sincere, echoed through the villa and drifted out into the night, reaching even the quiet trees who listened in their own way. Winter deepened, and with it the bond between them. The villa, though modest, felt full of warmth, of stories, of stillness that comforted rather than confined. Lucius often reflected during these months, his thoughts gentle and meandering like the smoke that curled from the chimney. He thought of the seasons behind him, and those yet to come. He thought of his father, and the old lessons that had shaped him, patience, humility, and the quiet strength found in living close to the earth. Tiberius began asking new kinds of questions, less about how things grew, and more about why they did. Why the stars returned each night in the same patterns, why people argued about things that could not be changed. Lucius didn't always have answers. Sometimes he simply nodded and said, "Ask again in spring, and perhaps the wind will tell you." And so winter passed, not in silence but in whispers, of wood crackling in the hearth, of pages turning, of quiet steps on stone floors. Outside, the world slept beneath a blanket of frost. Inside, a family dreamed together, not of distant lands or grand riches, but of new seeds, of peaceful days, and of the stories they would tell next. As the final snows melted and the air softened, the land stirred awake once more. Buds appeared on the branches, the soil darkened with readiness, and the sun, golden and familiar, returned to kiss the fields. Spring had arrived, and with it a new rhythm, a gentle resurgence of life, of movement, of song. But the heart of it remained unchanged. The family rose with the light, worked with their hands, and ended their days in each other's company, content not because life was easy, but because it was theirs. And so, in this quiet corner of ancient Rome, time moved softly on, carrying with it the peaceful legacy of a day well lived. Spring's arrival in the Roman countryside was not marked by fanfare, but by delicate, almost imperceptible shifts in the world. The air, once cold and brittle, turned soft and fragrant. The trees, bare and still for months, began to dress themselves in shades of green. Life returned gradually, first through birdsong, then the buzzing of bees, and finally in the subtle awakening of the soil beneath Lucius's sandals as he walked the land each morning. Lucius welcomed the season like an old friend. His movements were slow but confident, his eyes scanning the earth with reverence. The wheat sprouts were pushing through in tidy rows, and the grapevines showed their first green signs of promise. He knelt and ran his hands over the soil, feeling its warmth and weight. "It's ready," he murmured, mostly to himself, though Tiberius was nearby, listening. Tiberius had grown in the quiet of winter, not just in height, but in thought. His questions were fewer now, but more profound. He had started keeping a small journal of his own, noting what he observed each day. When the swallows returned, how the rain smelled different in March, the way sunlight filtered through fig leaves. Lucius watched him often from a distance, pride quietly swelling in his chest. He said little, but he felt everything. Marcia, too, flourished in spring. Her herb garden burst into life, sending lavender, mint, and basil scents dancing through the air. She rearranged the kitchen, opened the windows, and sewed new linen covers for the beds. In the afternoons, she worked outside with a contented smile, her fingers brushing rosemary sprigs while she hummed. The sun lit her face, and Lucius often paused from his chores just to watch her from across the field, still in awe after so many seasons together. As the days lengthened, the family found themselves outdoors more often. Meals under the pergola, walks along the stream that bordered their land, and quiet moments of simply sitting in the shade, listening. The gentle return of the village market brought new energy. Traders and neighbors returned with stories and goods, jars of honey, handmade sandals, dyed fabrics, and once a flute carved from laurel wood that Tiberius saved his coin to buy. The flute became part of their evenings. Tiberius practiced slowly, filling the villa with mellow notes that floated on the breeze. Sometimes he played while Marcia cooked and Lucius wrote. Other times he played for the animals who seemed to find the sound curious and calming. It was not mastery that mattered. It was the intention behind the music and the peace it brought. Midway through the season, the family decided to host a small gathering, something they hadn't done in many moons. Just a few neighbors, simple food, and a night under the stars. Lucius cleaned the courtyard with care. Marcia baked sweet loaves laced with fig and walnut, and Tiberius prepared a short tune to perform. When the evening came, lanterns flickered in the trees, and laughter filled the air. They spoke of weather and harvests, of Roman news carried by a traveler, of old tales retold by candlelight. The children played by the stream, and the elders reclined on woven mats sipping watered wine and savoring the night's peace. It was a modest affair, but it lingered in the heart longer than grand feasts. Lucius sat back at one point, watching it all, his soul full to the brim with gratitude. That night, after the guests had gone and the lamps had dimmed, Lucius stepped out under the stars. Tiberius joined him, and they stood together in silence looking skyward. The boy pointed. "Is that Saturn?" he asked. Lucius squinted and nodded. "Yes, slow and steady, like the seasons." "I think I want to learn more about the stars," Tiberius said quietly. "Not just their names, but where they go and why." Lucius put a hand on his son's shoulder. "Then that is what you shall do, but always come back to the earth. It will steady you." And so the days rolled on, the spring fading slowly into the golden hues of summer. The villa breathed with life, and so did those who lived within it. Fields grew thick with grain, the orchard promised a generous yield, and the bees worked tirelessly in the flowering time. Each morning began with the same simple rituals: water, splashed on the face, bread warmed by fire, a pause to greet the day and all it would offer. And each evening closed with the same contentment. A family gathered, stories exchanged, and the quiet understanding that though the world beyond might change, this small patch of earth would always be their sanctuary. The peace of ancient Rome's countryside was not just found in silence but in intention. In every gesture, every breath, every shared look, it was a peace that asked for nothing but presence and gave everything in return. With summer's arrival, the landscape surrounding Lucius's villa ripened into its fullest form. The wheat fields turned a warm gold, swaying gently under the midday sun like waves in a sleepy sea. The fig trees bore fruit heavy and sweet, and the vineyards were alive with clusters of swelling grapes that glowed faintly in the morning light. Each day seemed to move just a touch slower than the one before, as though time itself were stretching out to bask in the season's warmth. Lucius began his mornings earlier now, sometimes even before the roosters crowed. The rising sun painted the sky in streaks of amber and rose as he moved quietly through the dew-covered grass. In these moments, before even the birds began their songs, he felt a deep stillness, a kind of sacred hush that reminded him of prayers spoken without words. The tools he carried were old but cared for, their handles smoothed by time and use, and they rested in his hands like extensions of himself. Tiberius often joined him shortly after, still rubbing sleep from his eyes but eager to help. Though Lucius could do the work alone, he welcomed his son's company. Together they walked the rows of wheat and barley, noting which stalks were ready for harvest and which needed more time. Tiberius asked fewer questions now, but his eyes absorbed everything. Lucius didn't need to explain the importance of patience or attentiveness. His son learned by watching, and that was enough. Marcia, too, rose early in the summer months. She preferred the cool hours before the heat set in to tend her herbs and prepare food for the day. Her hands moved deftly through bunches of basil and dill, mint and marjoram, plucking only what she needed and leaving the rest to grow undisturbed. When she cooked, the aromas wafted through the villa and into the fields, where Lucius would pause and breathe deeply, smiling to himself. During the midday hours, when the sun was highest and the air thick with heat, the family sought refuge. In the villa's shaded interior, Tiberius read from a scroll Marcia had borrowed from a village scribe, a story of a Roman general and his faithful dog, written with flourishes and lessons on loyalty and courage. Marcia spun wool and embroidered a tunic for Lucius, her stitches, small and precise, each one a silent expression of care. Lucius wrote in his journal or rested, sometimes dreaming, sometimes simply listening to the quiet rhythm of his family's presence. As evening came, the world softened. The intense heat eased. The wind returned to the trees and the sky shifted from blue to a dusky lavender. The family would sit on stone benches in the courtyard, enjoying simple meals of lentils, grilled vegetables, and warm bread. Tiberius often played his flute, the melodies now smoother, more confident. Once, a nightingale sang along, its song intertwining with the notes, creating a harmony that made Marcia close her eyes and smile. One such evening, as they dined beneath the vines, Lucius looked at his family and spoke with quiet warmth. "Do you know what the best part of the harvest is?" Tiberius guessed. "The grain, the wine?" Lucius shook his head. "It's this, sitting here, knowing we've worked together, cared for the land, and now we rest together. That is the real gift." Marcia reached over and gently took his hand, her eyes soft. "Then we are very rich indeed." Later that week, a traveler passed through the village. He carried scrolls and curiosities, bits of news from Rome, and tales from distant parts of the empire. Lucius invited him to stay the night, and over supper, the traveler shared a story of an eclipse he had witnessed on the southern coast. Tiberius was captivated. "Did it get completely dark?" the boy asked, leaning forward. "Like twilight at midday," the traveler replied. Even the birds fell silent. After the traveler had gone, Tiberius spoke of visiting the coast someday, of seeing the sea and perhaps the cities beyond. Lucius nodded thoughtfully. "One day, yes. But no matter where you go, always remember this land. It is part of you." As summer deepened, harvest time drew closer. The fields, once green and bursting with life, began to bend with the weight of their bounty. Lucius led the family in careful planning, preparing the tools, checking the granary, sharpening blades, and setting aside jars for pickling and storing. On the first day of harvest, the sun rose into a cloudless sky. Marcia packed food and water, and the three of them set out into the fields. The work was slow and rhythmic, cutting, bundling, stacking. Sweat trickled down their necks and dust clung to their arms, but none of them complained. Each stroke of the sickle, each lift of a sheaf was part of something greater, something shared. They worked until the shadows grew long and the light turned golden. Then they sat beneath a fig tree and ate in silence, tired but content. Tiberius leaned against his father and whispered, "This is my favorite day." Lucius placed a hand on his shoulder and replied, "Mine too." As they made their way back to the villa, the sun dipped behind the hills, casting a warm glow over the land. The countryside exhaled, as though satisfied with the day's labors. In the distance, a dog barked, a cart rattled over stones, and somewhere a flute played faintly in the breeze, and so the cycle continued, not as repetition but as a gentle spiral, each season familiar yet new, each day shaped by care, by love, and by the quiet beauty of a life well lived. The following morning brought a softer light, filtered through a veil of thin clouds drifting lazily across the sky. The air carried a subtle coolness, a brief reprieve from the summer's intensity, and Lucius welcomed it with a quiet sigh as he stepped outside. The harvest had only just begun, but already he could feel the satisfaction of progress, a kind of quiet pride not born of accomplishment alone, but of harmony. The fields responded to their care, and in return, they offered their gifts. Tiberius was up early as well, his excitement undimmed by sore muscles. He had taken to the harvest with surprising stamina, his youthful energy tempered by a growing sense of responsibility. As they walked toward the fields together, father and son, the road beneath their feet felt as familiar as the path of thought through the mind, every stone, every curve known by heart. Today, a few neighbors joined them. Harvest, after all, was a communal event, Marcus and Flavia from the adjacent farm brought their grown sons, and even elderly Publius arrived, leaning on a cane to offer moral support and well-timed advice. Laughter broke the usual quiet of the land as greetings were exchanged and tasks divvied out. The work became a shared rhythm, scythes swishing through stalks, bundles stacking neatly under the sun, and voices calling out in light-hearted jest. Marcia, with her calm and steady presence, ensured that everyone was fed and watered. She moved. Between workers with baskets of dates, figs, and flatbread, her laughter as nourishing as the food she carried. When Tiberius took a short rest under the olive tree, she sat beside him and handed him a cup of watered wine. "You're becoming a man of the land just like your father," she said, brushing sweat from his brow. He smiled, a little embarrassed but clearly pleased. "Do you think I'll be ready one day to take care of it all?" "You already are," she replied gently. "But there's no rush. The land teaches us in its own time." That evening, with their bodies pleasantly sore and their baskets brimming with the day's yield, the families gathered at Lucius's villa for a small celebration. A fire crackled in the center of the courtyard, casting warm flickers of light against the stone walls. Wine was poured into simple clay cups, and roasted vegetables and honey cakes were passed around. Someone brought out a lyre, and soon soft music floated into the night. Tiberius listened, his head resting against his mother's shoulder, while Lucius talked quietly with Marcus about the weather, the roads, and the possibility of a good market. Price for olives this year. The mood was peaceful, full of shared effort and shared reward. When the stars began to emerge one by one, the courtyard fell into a gentle hush. Lucius stood and looked around at the familiar faces, his family, his neighbors, his land wrapped in the serene quiet of the countryside. He spoke softly, as if not to disturb the night. "These moments, they're the heart of who we are, not just the work or the yield, but this, being together." A few nodded, others raised their cups, and no more words were needed. As the last of the embers died down and guests returned to their homes, Lucius walked the edge of the vineyard in the moonlight. The vines whispered in the breeze, and the sky stretched wide above him, full of stars. He paused near the boundary stone, a marker that had stood for generations, and placed his hand on it. It was cool to the touch, solid and unmoving, much like the life he had built here. Back inside, Marcia had already tucked Tiberius into bed. The boy murmured sleepily, half in dream, "Papa, when we finish the harvest, can we go to the river again?" Lucius smiled. "Yes, my son, as soon as we're done." And so the days continued in their gentle rhythm. The wheat gave way to the olives to the grapes, and each task carried its own season, its own lessons. Tiberius grew stronger and more assured, his hands learning the feel of the soil, the weight of tools, the cycles of the earth. Marcia kept the home steady, weaving together days with the quiet grace of someone who understands the deep power of routine. And Lucius, with each passing sunrise, felt both the weight and joy of stewardship. Occasionally, news from Rome trickled. A new law passed, a noble fallen from grace, a festival declared, but it all felt distant, like ripples in a faraway pond. Here, in the countryside, life held a different pace. Their world was built on seasons and sunrises, on laughter shared over meals, on the quiet moments before sleep. One late afternoon, as autumn painted the hills with subtle amber hues, Lucius took Tiberius up the hill behind their villa, a place where the whole valley lay spread out before them. They sat in silence for a long while, watching the wind play across the fields, the smoke curl from nearby chimneys. "Do you remember when you first asked me about the stars?" Lucius said eventually. Tiberius nodded. "You told me they were older than the empire," Lucius chuckled softly. "That's right, and they'll still be here long after we're gone, just like this land if we take care of it." "I'll take care of it, Papa. I know you will." As night approached, they walked back home slowly, the sky darkening above them, their footsteps light. Inside, the villa glowed with firelight and the scent of rosemary stew. Marcia was waiting, and so was the familiar peace of evening. And thus, as seasons turned and years passed, the villa remained a quiet sanctuary, a place of balance and grace where the past met the present, and every day was a story gently unfolding beneath the Roman sky. Winter approached with a soft hush rather than a roar. The fields, once alive with the hum of cicadas and the rustle of wheat, now lay dormant under a pale sky. Morning mists lingered longer, veiling the hills and olive trees in a delicate whiteness. That seemed to slow time even further. Lucius welcomed the change. There was a certain peace in the earth's slumber, a gentle reminder that rest was not weakness but wisdom. Inside the villa, life adjusted accordingly. Fires were kept burning low in the hearth, their glow turning the stone walls golden and warm. Marcia's spinning wheel turned steadily, her hands weaving wool into blankets, cloaks, and tunics. Tiberius sat nearby, a scroll in his lap, mouthing out the words as he practiced his Latin. Lucius repaired tools and checked the wine casks in the storeroom, ensuring their seals held strong against the creeping cold. The family spent more time indoors, and the villa seemed to draw them closer together. In the evenings, after the last embers had been stirred and the lamps lit, they gathered near the hearth for stories. Some old Roman legends, some simple village tales. Others shared memories of the past year. Tiberius, with his growing confidence, began to tell stories of his own invention, weaving heroes and farmers into myths of the land they knew so well. His parents listened with smiles, proud of the curiosity blooming in their son's heart. When the village held its midwinter festival, Lucius and his family made their way down the winding path to join their neighbors. The small forum was adorned with garlands of dried herbs and pine, and the air smelled of roasted chestnuts and spiced wine. Children chased each other in circles while elders exchanged news beneath the eaves of the temple. A priest offered a quiet blessing for the turning of the year, and the crowd responded with soft applause. It was a modest celebration, but sincere, and as Lucius looked around at the familiar faces, weathered by sun and season but still bright with life, he felt a quiet fullness in his chest. Later, under the starlit sky, Marcia slipped her hand into his as they walked home. "Another year well lived," she murmured. Lucius nodded. "And another to come." Winter eventually yielded to spring, as it always did. The fields awakened with tiny green shoots, and the air grew sweeter, laced with the scent of wildflowers and tilled earth. Tiberius took to the fields with a renewed energy, running ahead of Lucius to check the irrigation ditches and call out the first signs of sprouting grain. Birds returned to the trees, filling the mornings with song, and the goats in the pen grew restless with the promise of warmer days. As the days lengthened, so did their to-do list. Lucius began planning repairs to the vineyard trellises, while Marcia traded surplus wool at the village market for a new clay pot and a satchel of dried figs. Tiberius helped plant herbs and vegetables in neat rows behind the villa, laughing each time a worm wriggled from the soil. "They're the real farmers," Lucius joked one afternoon, wiping his brow. "We just work around them." By midsummer, their routine had resumed its full rhythm, and the land responded in kind. Wheat swayed tall and golden, the vineyard brimmed with promise, and the orchard hummed with bees. On one particularly warm day, Lucius and Tiberius took the mule cart down to the river to fetch water and enjoy a brief respite from the heat. They rested in the shade of a great willow tree, its branches trailing the current, and watched dragonflies dart above the surface. Tiberius, now on the verge of his 13th summer, had grown taller and more sure-footed. He leaned back against the tree, eyes closed, listening to the water's gentle song. "Do you think I'll be a good farmer, Papa?" he asked softly. Lucius looked at him, noting the calluses on his hands, the wisdom slowly forming behind his bright eyes. "You already are," he said, "a good farmer, a good son, and one day a good man." The boy smiled, and they sat in companionable silence until the sun began its descent behind the hills. That evening, back at the villa, Lucius took a quiet moment alone under the pergola. The vines above his head rustled softly in the breeze, and the air was thick with the smell of basil and ripening fruit. He gazed out at his land, the neat rows, the fruit-heavy trees, the smoke curling from the neighbor's chimney, and felt again that same deep contentment he had known since his youth. This land, this life, was not one of fame or fortune, but of meaning. It was a rhythm, an understanding, a relationship built on time and tenderness. Marcia called him inside, her voice gentle. "Come, it's time." He rose, casting one last glance at the twilight-drenched countryside. Inside, the lamp was already lit, casting long shadows across the floor. Tiberius was helping set the table, and the scent of rosemary and garlic filled the air. Another day completed, another moment of calm. As they sat to eat, laughter filling the air, Lucius realized something deeply simple and profoundly true. This was the heart of Rome, not captured in monuments or marble, but in the soft moments of ordinary lives, in families who lived close to the land, and in the quiet power of days like this. And as we gently bring this part of Lucius and his family's story to a close, let us carry with us the peace of their days, the soft sounds, the warm connections, and the steady rhythm of a life well lived. If you've enjoyed this calm journey through the fields and hearths of ancient Rome, we invite you to join us again. Subscribe, like, and share to help us continue bringing peaceful stories like this into your world. Let the past be your lullaby, and may every night find you cradled in quiet and rest.